Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the Marion Adams Memorial Lecture. As many of you may know, if you've attended this lecture before, it is one of the highlights of the arts calendar, and it's a great pleasure to welcome David and members of the family to be with us again this evening. It's a particular pleasure for me to welcome our guest speaker, Petro Georgiou, to address us this evening. Petro, born in Greece in 1947, came to Australia with his family as a very young 7-year-old, went to Melbourne Boys High School, and then where I first met him in the Political Science Department here at Melbourne University. This is not in the speaker's notes, Petro, but my first memory of you is as a smoker, giving a staff seminar, I believe, on aspects of organisation theory in the Prussian army, but I could be wrong about that, and I could see you barely through the smoke. Such was the intensity both of the delivery and the smoking, not just by you, I should say, but many members of the department in those days. He left the Political Science Department with first-class honours, and in 1995 became Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser before moving on to become Secretary of the Ethnic Television Review Panel and later State Director of the Liberal Party of Australia. As you're aware, he's held the seat of Kooyong here in Melbourne since 1994 and has become a very distinguished and important member not only of the Liberal Party in Canberra, but of the Parliament generally, serving with distinction in a number of important committees, most recently including the House Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs, and importantly the Joint Standing Committee on Migration. You will know him, I'm sure, for a number of important contributions he's made to the debate on multiculturalism, on identity, on citizenship, on federal policy in regard to refugees and the like. And it's a special treat for us to have him back because he's one of our alums and one of our distinguished former members of staff, but also because the topic is of such great importance not only to the university but the community. And as you know, he's come to talk to us about the limits of tolerance, diversity, identity and cohesion. Please make Petro very welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really good to be back at Melbourne University again. You know you're getting old when the coppers look like teenagers and the heads of departments look like very, very young men. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people, the traditional custodians of this land, and I'd also like to pay respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation. Professor Mark Considine, Dean of Arts. Yes, we did smoke a lot in those days, and some of us still do. Mr. David Adams and family, Melbourne University staff and students, distinguished guests, thank you for the invitation to give the annual Marion Adams Memorial Lecture. It seems to me that this annual public lecture is an exceptionally fitting way to celebrate a distinguished career, the distinguished career of Professor Adams and her long association with Melbourne University, both as a student and as a respected member of staff. As Dean of the Faculty of Arts from 1988 until 1993, significantly the first woman to be appointed to this position, Professor Adams played a far-reaching role within the university community. This role continues today through the Marion Adams Fund and through the support given to the university by her husband David Adams, and it's really good to see him and the family here tonight. I am honoured to be here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, since the European settlement of Australia in 1788, political leaders and the community at large have contended with issues relating to ethnic, cultural, religious and racial diversity. Issues such as how much diversity can be tolerated without jeopardising social cohesion, who belongs to the identity we wish for ourselves and who does not, how should diversity be managed, and what differences should be encouraged or tolerated, and what should be discouraged or prohibited. Tonight, what I'd like to do is to examine the public responses to these issues both historically and progressively, or as they say in the classics, going forward. In Australia, there are three key arenas in which the limits of racial, cultural, ethnic and religious diversity have been tested and are being tested. The first is in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. The second is at our borders and is defined by our immigration policies. The third is in the policies directed at managing cultural and ethnic diversity within Australia. I have to admit at the outset that it's a deficiency in my presentation that it does not focus on the first of these areas, the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Of all the components of our history, this is the one where a black armband view is warranted. Unfortunately, constraints of time, talent and knowledge prevent me from doing the subject justice this evening. In the other areas, the position I'll be advancing is in broad terms as follows. Government responses have at times been determined by an aversion to diversity, a perception that diversity threatens the welfare of the community. At other times, diversity has been seen as a circumstance that could be reasonably accommodated and tolerated, and even beyond this, welcomed and respected. In the course of our history, Australian policymakers and the general community have clearly moved in the direction of being less fearful and more accepting of diversity. But the movement has been neither linear nor orderly. The plain fact, which I'm sure you will know, is that there's no law of inevitable progress. And in the last decade, at national level, I believe we've regressed. The relationship between politicians and the community is a complex one. Our leaders make choices dictated by their personal and their political views, and also by their perceptions of social and not least political realities. Their statements and their actions are both influenced by, excuse me, and have an influence on the sentiments of people in the community. Today, I believe that we are in a hiatus, a gap between the immediate past and the potential future. There is uncertainty about which direction we should be taking. I've got a perspective about where we should be heading, but to get an orientation, we first need to understand where we've been. So, as is fitting in an arts faculty, I'll start with a historical overview of how government and community has responded to issues of diversity, identity and cohesion in the context of immigration and domestic policies, and I'll then offer some views about key issues that we are faced by and how we should address them. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from policies towards Indigenous Australians, our immigration policies have historically manifested the most significant measures of dealing with diversity. Throughout much of the history of European settlement, who was excluded and who was sought was determined by national and by racial favouritism. The White Australia policy was the most notorious of the exclusionary policies. Racially based immigration restrictions was a subject of the first law passed by the federal government, Parliament in 1901. These are the words of our first Prime Minister. The fear of Chinese immigration, which the Australian democracy cherishes, is in fact the instinct of self-preservation quickened by experience. We are guarding the last part of the world in which the higher races can live, and increasingly freely, for the higher civilisation. Who was the first Prime Minister? You all have problems with the citizenship test. In the first part of the 20th century, the migration of non-Asian groups was also periodically restricted. Pacific Islanders were excluded in the very early days of Federation, and those who were resettled were expelled. In 1924, a quota was imposed on Albanians, Yugoslavs and Greeks. I could go on about exclusion, but the point is that it was only after the end of the Second World War that the government, fearing that Australia had to populate or perish, to coin that fantastic phrase, extended support for immigration beyond the British Isles to other parts of Europe. But even in the face of the perceived threat to national survival, the government remained committed to minimising the diversification of our population. In 1946, Labor's Minister for Immigration told Parliament that it is my hope that for every foreign migrant, there will be 10 people from the United Kingdom's aliens, and will continue to be admitted only in such numbers and of such classes that they can be readily assimilated. A Labor minister and such classes that can readily be assimilated. Very interesting. Increasingly, however, the use of race and nationality as criteria for immigration became attenuated. The notorious dictation test was abandoned by the Menzies government in 1958. The White Australia policy was weakened by the Holt government. It was dismembered by the Gough-Whitlam Labor government, and it was buried by Malcolm Fraser when we accepted Indo-Chinese refugees arriving here by boat. The progressive dismantling of discriminatory barriers was an achievement of political leadership and, I think it should be said, of statesmanship. It was not a function of electoral necessity. Public opinion was divided, but those who believed that Australia could accept the reforms appeared to have been vindicated. Personally, by the end of the 1970s, I thought that the future of a non-discriminatory immigration policy was secure. I was actually wrong. Non-discriminatory immigration, and particularly from Asia, continued to be assailed within political circles and by prominent intellectuals such as Geoffrey Blaney. And all this was not just an academic sideshow. The possibility of reversion became apparent in 1988 when the then the opposition leader, John Howard, publicly canvassed the question of whether Asian immigration should be reduced. He said, "I do believe that if it is in the eyes of some in the community that it's too great, it would be in our immediate term interest and supporting of social cohesion if it will slow down a little, so that the capacity of the community to absorb it was greater." Prime Minister Hawke responded with a parliamentary motion that no Australian government would use race or ethnic origin as a criterion for immigration. And at that stage, 4 members of the Liberal Party crossed the floor to vote with the government. 7 years later, John Howard said, and quite clearly did, regret his statement of 1988. But the election of Pauline Hanson in 1996 reignited the debate. In her maiden speech, she said, and I can almost quote her verbatim from memory, but I won't distort her, "I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. Between 1984 and 1995, 40% of all migrants coming to this country were of Asian origin. They have their own culture and religion, form ghettos, and do not assimilate." The Hanson phenomenon did have a major impact on Australia, but I think it's important to underscore that whatever criticisms to be made of the political parties in their response to Hansonism, it is to their credit that they did not waver in upholding the principle of non-discriminatory immigration. In October 1996, John Howard, by then Prime Minister, moved a motion on racial tolerance which read in part that this House reaffirms its commitment to maintaining an immigration policy wholly non-discriminatory on the grounds of race, colour, creed or origin. And that motion was carried in both houses of Parliament. The pressure for discrimination built up again following the 2001 terrorist attacks in the US and later the attacks in Bali, in Madrid and in London. Pauline Hanson, and she was not alone, did call for restrictions on Muslim immigration. I think that we all know that heightened security fears always place a great strain on our commitment to principle. But once again, the fact that no major political party contemplated a return to a discriminatory immigration policy, despite the fact that in this climate of fear, this could have been exploited politically, the fact that it was not advanced demonstrated how much we had changed and how much we'd come as a society. I have to admit that I was greatly relieved, because when I was young, what was controversial was to argue that race should not be used as a determinant of who should be allowed to migrate to Australia. By my early adulthood, Australia had changed with remarkable ease, and we changed from preventing people from entering Australia because of their colour to accepting them regardless of their race, ethnicity or religion. And I believe that I'm in unison with most Australians in believing that we are a better society for this. But what's important, and what I hope my brief overview has brought out, is that our achievement was not predestined and it is not invulnerable to challenge. We have got there, but we have got there by fits and starts, and maintenance of non-discrimination at our borders does need to be reinforced constantly. Vigilance and voice are required, and they will be particularly required if our growth slows. And the fact still does remain that our commitment to a non-discriminatory immigration policy has been matched by a period of severe regression in our treatment of asylum seekers. We have in the past few years, and I think with some success, tried to remedy this. I believe that we've learned that the policy of mandatory detention hurts vulnerable men, women and children, and that it damages the humanity of all of us. But I think that we need to recognise that the advances could be replaced by regression, and I think we need to be very alert to this. Ladies and gentlemen, on the domestic front, the overall movement has been towards the greater acceptance of diversity, but again, not without resistance or regression. Excuse me. I have spoken in the past, all too often unfortunately, about multiculturalism as the most sensible policy and framework for a society which sought to treat its newly arrived immigrants coming from diverse backgrounds, and how we should respond as a nation. For many years, in discussing multiculturalism, religion was not a central issue. Today, however, religious diversity has emerged as a new focus for contention. I believe we have to publicly recognise and re-emphasise that our history shows that the conflict based on religious difference is not new to our nation and has not been a function of Muslims. We should acknowledge this when we are dealing with what is sometimes presented as a novel issue regarding the place of religion in our society. Not least, we should recognise that Australia's historic responses to religious conflicts have endowed us with a legacy. This legacy is relevant today, and it should inform current policies. In the colonial era, amongst the newly arrived settlers, a preeminent difference was between those of Irish Catholic origins and those of English Protestant backgrounds. There was a heady combination of ethnicity, nationality and religion, which gave rise to distinct identities. These found expression in economic and social discrimination, in disagreements about public policy, and in outbreaks of violence. This is exemplified by the rebellion of Irish convicts at Vinegar Hill in 1804, and the fact that Catholic priests were blamed for contributing to the spirit of rebellion and were punished by having their permission to minister withdrawn. By the mid-1800s, sectarian tensions had diminished, and on St Patrick's Day in 1859, Catholics and Protestants in Yass came together at a civic function where community leaders of both faiths praised the local residents for being, in the words of one, able to appreciate the sterling good qualities of each other without reference to creed or race. Over the next 2 decades, this harmony wilted. The attempted assassination of British Prince Alfred by Irishman Henry James in 1868 led to a strong anti-Catholic reaction. Henry Parkes, who coined the phrase, "We are one people with one destiny," that we read about in contemporary attempts to convince people what it is to be Australian, Henry Parkes was often described as being the father of federation, but he did have some problems with some of the people who had the one destiny. The Irish, according to Parkes, were jabbering baboons and destructive troublemakers. Thanks, Dad. One consequence of the anti-Irish sentiment was the withdrawal of state funding to all faith-based schools. The withdrawal of support for these schools and the promotion of secular education for all was seen as a measure to address the divisiveness of religious diversity. During the First World War, Catholics and non-Catholics were again divided by the issue of conscription and the fact that many Catholics, particularly those of Irish origin, did not want to fight for Britain. But later, in the course of the 20th century, the intensity and sweep of the sectarian rift again abated. By the 1960s, Catholic and Protestant groups were campaigning together on the issue of state aid for religious schools. The Menzies government, I have to say to its credit, reintroduced government funding for denominational schools, and this became a bipartisan policy. By the time that I became the director of the Australian Institute of Multicultural Affairs in 1980, it was common to hear the majority of Australians being described as being Anglo-Celtic in origin. Given that the history, this was clearly a confected identity, and the term was by no means universally accepted. But I think the fact is important that because it was coined and widely used, reflected the erosion of a long-standing and powerful division which previous generations, and indeed the generation that lived at that stage, might well have believed was insurmountable. Apparently, migrants from non-traditional sources had something to do with overcoming these divisions. Author Thomas Keneally, for example, has written of his own childhood experience at the interface between Catholics and Protestants. And Keneally wrote, "By the late 1940s, we found ourselves combined in mistrust of the Balts, Southern Europeans and other refos. The streets of our suburbs were full of men and women who believed these arrivals would never become a part of Australian society. Their strangeness disqualified them." Well, refos, Balts, Southern Europeans and other assorted people like myself are always pleased to have a positive effect, no matter how unintended. But the bottom line is that when my family and I arrived in Australia from Greece at the beginning of the 1950s, we were expected to assimilate, and to assimilate as fast as possible. We were never quite sure what we should assimilate to. What was meant was not specified in laws or regulations or even images, although I've got to say Chips Rafferty was somebody that I would like grown up like. But what we were sure of was that we had to discard, that we were expected to discard valued aspects of our original culture and heritage. Manifestly, the expression and celebration of the languages and cultures of the so-called New Australians were tolerated rather than respected. We did have our private spaces, but public recognition and support were not forthcoming, not for a very long time. But as the number and diversity of migrants increased, it became apparent that assimilation was not an appropriate or an equitable policy, and beyond this, that people were simply not ready to abandon their valued heritages. Migrants overwhelmingly did commit to Australia, to its democratic values and institutions, and to English as the national language. But at the same time, they created schools, religious institutions, and voluntary associations to preserve and develop valued aspects of their cultures. They worked to change the views of politicians, of the media, and of the public at large. And assimilation gave way briefly to integration. But the opportunity was there for a more inspired policy response, a multicultural policy for a multicultural nation. Gough Whitlam made the first significant moves in this area, and Malcolm Fraser made the commitment to multiculturalism in terms of multicultural policies and multicultural institutions. A strong imprimatur of the head of government was essential, and I can personally attest to the fact that Malcolm Fraser, as Prime Minister, gave that both in public and in private. He explained in the keynote speech in 1981 that the decision to respond to ethnic diversity with multicultural policies was based on both realism and idealism, which was a little bit of a catchphrase in those days. He believed that the attempt to enforce conformity is demonstrably costly both for the individual and for the society. He believed that it denied people their identity and their self-esteem, and that it risked alienation and social division. Explaining the meaning of multiculturalism, Malcolm Fraser said, "Multiculturalism is concerned with far more than the passive toleration of diversity. It sees diversity as a quality to be actively embraced, a source of social worth and dynamism. It encourages all groups to be open and to interact